What if one of the most famous military warnings in history was a complete lie? After Pearl Harbor, Japan's top generals were confident they could bring America to its knees. But their most brilliant strategist, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, supposedly stopped them cold. He painted a terrifying picture of an America where every citizen was a soldier, a nation with a rifle behind every blade of grass. It's a powerful story of defiance that has shaped how we see American strength. But it's not the whole story. The truth of what Yamamoto really feared was something far more chilling than an army of civilians, a secret hidden not in American homes, but in its factories and its very soul. The legend is one of the most compelling in military history. In late 1941, with the Imperial Japanese High Command drunk on victory, they began to seriously discuss a full-scale invasion of the American mainland. It was then that Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, supposedly silenced the room. He had spent years in America, and he knew something the others didn't. He didn't speak of armies or navies. He spoke of the American people. The story goes that he explained that in Japan only soldiers carried guns, but in America, guns were in nearly every home. He described a nation of hunters and marksmen where fathers taught their sons to shoot as a rite of passage. Invading America, he allegedly warned, would be a nightmare. You would be fighting not just an army, but 100 million armed citizens on their home turf. This single, terrifying idea of a rifle behind every blade of grass was said to be the reason Japan never dared to set foot on the West Coast. It's a fantastic story. But as historians dug deeper, they uncovered a shocking fact. There is absolutely no proof Yamamoto ever said it. The legendary quote that defined a nation's strength appears to be a complete myth. So, if the story was just a myth, then what was the real secret weapon Yamamoto saw in America? The truth was something he had witnessed firsthand during his time studying at Harvard and serving as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. It wasn't the guns in their homes, it was the smoke rising from their factories. Yamamoto was haunted by America's staggering industrial capacity. He saw the endless assembly lines of Detroit, the sprawling steel mills of Pittsburgh, and understood that America wasn't just a country, it was an industrial volcano waiting to erupt. While Japan's industry struggled to build a few hundred planes a month, he knew Ford's factories could be converted to produce a bomber an hour. He famously told Japan's prime minister before the war, "If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." That was his real, documented warning. He knew that Japan could win battles, but America could win a war of production. The real secret weapon wasn't a single rifle. It was the ability to create 10,000 tanks, 1,000 ships, and 1,000,000 rifles to replace any that were lost. Even if Japan could somehow match America's production, which they couldn't, they faced an enemy that no amount of fighting spirit could defeat: the Pacific Ocean itself. The distance from Japan to California is over 5,000 miles. An invasion would require the largest naval armada in human history, and every single ship would be a floating target. Yamamoto, a brilliant naval strategist, knew this better than anyone. His plans hinged on quick, decisive battles, not a prolonged war of logistics. The supply lines for an invasion force would be stretched impossibly thin, a fragile chain of ships carrying every bullet, every bag of rice, and every drop of fuel. American submarines, which proved to be devastatingly effective, would have hunted these convoys relentlessly. An invading army, even if it managed to land, would quickly be starved, isolated, and annihilated. It was a logistical nightmare from which there was no awakening. The war would be lost before the first soldier stepped on the beach, not by bullets, but by fuel gauges hitting empty thousands of miles from home. This leads to the other legendary quote attributed to Yamamoto. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Much like the rifle quote, there's no primary evidence he actually wrote or said these exact words. they were immortalized in the 1970 film Tora, Tora, Tora. But unlike the rifle myth, this one perfectly captured his deepest strategic fear. Yamamoto never believed the attack on Pearl Harbor would destroy America. His goal was to cripple the Pacific Fleet so badly that America would be forced to negotiate a peace, leaving Japan to dominate Asia. He had fundamentally misunderstood the American psyche. The attack didn't break them, it forged them. The sleeping giant wasn't just the military, it was the unified will of 130 million people who were now enraged. Factories went into 24/7 production, not because of a government decree, but because workers were furious. Millions of men lined up at recruitment centers, not just because they were drafted, but because they wanted revenge. Yamamoto's real fear was that he hadn't scared America into submission. He had kicked the world's biggest hornet's nest, and the swarm was now heading right for him. The strategic nightmare didn't end there. Japanese military doctrine was built around the idea of the decisive battle, a single, glorious engagement that would shatter the enemy's army and their will to fight. It's how they had defeated Russia in 1905 and how they planned to defeat the United States. But America had no single breaking point. What would a decisive battle even look like? Capturing Washington, D.C. would be a symbolic victory, but the war would continue from state capitals. Annihilating the army on the West Coast would be a catastrophe, but new armies would be raised in the Midwest. The country was simply too big, too decentralized, and too resilient. An invasion wouldn't be a war, it would be a quagmire. It would become an endless occupation, fighting against a hostile population across a landmass the size of a continent. There was no capital to capture that would end the war, no emperor to force into surrender. It would be a war with no victory, only a slow, grinding, and inevitable defeat. Here lies the ultimate, shocking irony. While Americans built a myth around a civilian militia that never had to fight, the Japanese were planning for one that was terrifyingly real. As the war turned against them and an American invasion of the Japanese home islands loomed, the High Command initiated Operation Ketsugo. This was their final, desperate defense plan. The goal was to make the invasion so costly, so bloody, that America would offer peace terms instead of demanding unconditional surrender. And the core of this plan was the mobilization of the entire civilian population. The government began training ordinary people, from young men to elderly women, not with modern rifles, but with whatever they could find. They were being trained to conduct suicide attacks on American tanks with satchel charges. They were being taught to charge beaches with sharpened bamboo spears. The plan called for a horrifying mobilization of the populace, turning every town and village into a fortress. This was the real fight-to-the-last scenario, a vision that showed just how far Japan was willing to go. The most detailed plan for a civilian militia in Kyukyuku wasn't an American defense, but a Japanese death pact. In the end, the famous story of Yamamoto's warning is a powerful piece of folklore. It speaks to a spirit of independence and defiance, but the truth is far more revealing about the nature of modern warfare. Japan didn't invade America not because they feared a farmer with a shotgun, but because they feared the factory that could make 10,000 shotguns. They were stopped not by the threat of a rifle behind every blade of grass, but by the reality of thousands of miles of unforgiving ocean. And they were ultimately defeated by the terrible resolve of a nation they had tragically underestimated. The myth makes for a great story, but the reality is a far more important lesson. Yamamoto, the man who tried to warn his country, understood it from the beginning. You cannot defeat an enemy who can replace their losses faster than you can inflict them. And in that chilling calculation, Japan had already lost the war before the first shot was even fired. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into history as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that challenge what you think you know. See you in the next one.